Welcome to segment number 2 of chapter 34. This is about the origin and evolution of vertebrates, and in this segment we're actually going to focus on vertebrates. And vertebrates include all other animals that are also chordates. However, they have vertebrae as opposed to the simple chordates or the basal chordates. So this segment, we're going to focus on vertebrates, but we're not going to discuss the vertebrates are going to include a group of animals, which is basically most animals, that have vertebrae. So if we look at the tree in a previous segment from chapter 33, echinodermata were discussed. Remember, those are invertebrates, and those are not chordates either, but they are deuterostomes. And then the last segment, if you had listened to it, which is the first segment of chapter 34, discussed the general characteristics of chordates and also the basal groups of chordates, which are not vertebrates. And those are the cephalochordata, which are the lancelets, and the urochordata, which are the tunicates. And remember, they do have a notochord along with 3 other characteristics, which may or may not continue to exist during their developmental stages. Now, we are going to focus on the vertebrates. And in this segment, these are organisms which have vertebrae. Some of them are going to have jaws and a mineralized skeleton. Some of them will actually have lungs or some derivative of a lung. Some of them will have fins, lobe fins or ray fins. And then we're going to stop at amphibia. So we're going to split the tetrapods into 2. Because the reptilia are also amniotes, and we're going to stop at the end of vertebrates, however, exclude the amniotes and the primates. So the amphibia are going to contain limbs with digits. Now, the vertebrates that we're going to discuss today include some major groups which divide into first the vertebrates, then the gnathostomes. Okay, so those are going to have jaws. And then the Osteichthyans. So those are going to begin the group that actually have lungs or some derivative of lungs. And then the lobe-finned, which of course are going to have fins that are lobe-like. And then we're going to move into some organisms that begin to have some sort of limb, and eventually the amphibia, which have limbs with digits. Now let's take a look at the vertebrates. The vertebrates, again, are a group of chordates. That's a subgroup of chordates, which also have a backbone. They have a skeletal system and also a complex nervous system. These skeleton and the skeletal system and the complex nervous system has allowed the vertebrates to be more efficient in 2 different tasks. First, they're more efficient in capturing food. And they're more efficient in evading predators. The vertebrates have 2 or more sets of Hox genes. Now, the lancelets and the tunicates only have 1 cluster of Hox genes. So the vertebrates have more Hox genes than the lancelets and the tunicates. Vertebrates also have the following characters. So these are characters that the general chordates or the basal chordates do not have. They have vertebrae, which encloses a spinal cord, which is part of the complex nervous system. They have an elaborate skull, and they have fin rays if they are aquatic. All right, let's start with the vertebrates that do not have jaws, and that includes the hagfishes, the myxini, and the Petromyzonidida, which are the lampreys. So what's important to remember is that fossil evidence has shown that the earliest vertebrates actually didn't have jaws, and these are the ones that lead to those vertebrae or those vertebrates that do have jaws. Again, the majority of the vertebrates that have evolved after these groups do have jaws. So the 2 lineages of jawless vertebrates remain today, right? So they still exist. They are the hagfishes and the lampreys, and the proper names are myxini and Petromyzonidida. Now, they all lack a backbone, but they do have rudimentary vertebrae. And phylogenetic analysis of all genes in their genomes puts them in the vertebrates category. So they are considered vertebrates. However, they have rudimentary vertebrae and they lack a jaw. These two groups form a clade called the cyclostomes. Now let's start with the hagfishes. The hagfishes make up the proper name group called the Myxinae. And again, these are an example, one of the groups of the jawless vertebrates. So if we take a look at them, we can see there are teeth. They do have a skull that is made of cartilage. They have, again, I've already mentioned this, reduced vertebrae. They have a flexible rod of cartilage that's derived from the notochord. So the notochord forms into the rod of cartilage. Again, it's not going to form the vertebrae because remember they have reduced vertebrae. They have a very small brain. They actually have eyes, ears, and tooth-like formations, as you can see in this image right here. Here, this shows a hagfish where they have, it's pointing out the slime glands, and the slime glands actually produce and they project out slime, which protects them from predators. They are mostly marine and typically bottom dwelling, and they scavenge for food. The lampreys are quite an interesting group, Petromyzontidae. They're parasitic and they feed by clamping their mouth onto live fish. So these are them individually, but you can see them attached to fish right here on the image to the right. They inhabit the marine and freshwater habitats, so you may find them attached to fish in a lake. They have cartilage segments that are made of cartilage, and it surrounds the notochord. And these segments kind of arch over the nerve cord as well. Now you can see here, this image in the middle shows that, again, they are one of the two groups of cyclostomes, and stoma really kind of refers to a mouth, and cyclo, of course, would refer to like a circular shaped mouth. So here, this is pretty much their structure of their mouth, and this is what attaches to the other animals, like fish. Now, the gnathostomes are the next major group. So here we just talked about the cyclostomes. Now we're dealing with the gnathostomes, and the gnathostomes are the vertebrates that actually have jaws. Today, the jawed vertebrates are considered the gnathostomes, so that's a name given to the vertebrates that have jaws. And of course, it includes all of the other vertebrates. It includes the sharks and their relatives, the ray-finned fishes, the lobe-finned fishes, the amphibians, the reptiles, the mammals, even us. We are gnathostomes. All right, so let's talk about what a jaw is. A jaw is basically a hinge structure. This hinge structure allows, of course, with the help of teeth, allows the organisms to actually group the food and slice the food up as they're eating. So the jaws are hypothesized to have evolved by modification of the skeletal rods, which actually support the gill slits. All right, let's look at some other characteristics that are common to gnathostomes. Now again, they may not be included in all gnathostomes, and we'll explain that as we go through. 1, genome duplication, and this included duplication of the Hox genes. So remember, the Hox genes are a set of genes that are involved in development, and they actually direct the organization of the organism, especially those organisms that have segments and appendages attached to each segment. They have an enlarged forebrain in general, and again, the enlarged forebrain is going to be associated with enhanced nervous system, specifically in this group, enhanced smell and vision. The lateral line system is going to be present in the aquatic gnathostomes. And again, this is associated with the nervous system, more specifically to sensitivity and feeling or sensing of vibrations around them. Now, there are three lineages of jawed vertebrates that survive today. The Chondrichthyans, the ray-finned fish, which are called the Actinopterygii, again, the P is silent, and the Actinidia, the lobe-finned fish. Starting with the Chondrichthyans, the Chondrichthyans, or Chondrichthyes, as noted in the tree, they have a skeleton that's mainly made up of cartilage. This includes a very, very large and more diverse group of the sharks, including the sharks, the rays, and the skates. And then there's a smaller subgroup which include the ratfishes and the chimeras. There's only a few dozen. Just take a look at some of these. Look, we have some sharks and some rays and chimeras, and look at their little face. Isn't that cute? All right, so those are the examples of the Chondrichthyans. Let's look at some details of sharks. Sharks have a streamlined body and are very swift swimmers. You may be very familiar with them. And you can see the examples below. Some of them are suspension feeders, as the top left, but most of them are going to be carnivores. They have a short digestive tract with a ridge called the spiral valve. This increases the digestive surface area. Because they have a short digestive tract, the spiral valve adjusts for this to make them a little bit more efficient in digestion. They have very acute senses, including sight, smell, and the ability to detect electrical fields from nearby animals. Some other details about sharks and other organisms as well. It's important to remember organisms. The shark eggs are, interestingly, fertilized internally, but the embryos can develop in many different ways. Okay, so this applies to sharks. However, the embryo development can apply to different organisms. So those in which the embryos are oviparous mean the eggs hatch outside the mother's body, so they're going to develop outside the body. Ovoviviparous are those where the embryo develops within a uterus and is nourished by the egg yolk. And viviparous are where the embryo develops within the uterus and is nourished by the yolk sac placenta from the mother's blood. So the reproductive tract of sharks and the secretory system and the digestive tract actually empty in a common structure called the cloaca. So all of these systems, the reproductive system, the excretory system, and the digestive system, are all connected in a way. Now look at the next group. Now these are all Chondrichthyans. However, the Chondrichthyans divide into other subgroups. One of them is the Osteichthyans. So the Osteichthyans are going to include the Actinopterygii, the Actinidia, and the Dipnoi. A couple of the groups of those Osteichthyans include the Actinopterygii, or the Actinopterygii, or the ray-finned fishes, and the Actinidia, which are the lobe-finned fishes. Osteichthyans specifically have a bony endoskeleton, so they're not made mostly of cartilage like the Chondrichthyans. The Osteichthyans include the bony fishes, of course, and the tetrapods are also included in this group. Aquatic Osteichthyans are typically called fishes, so we just commonly call them fishes. However, the proper word for it would be aquatic Osteichthyans. Fishes have a lateral line system which consists of a series of canals and sensory and like nervous tissue, which allow them to detect movements and different pressure and just disturbances in the water around them. Most species are oviparous, which means that the embryo is going to develop outside of the body, but some of them have internal fertilization and birthing. Let's look at the typical structure of a bony fish. So most fishes breathe by drawing water over their gills, as you can see right here, which is protected by an operculum. So the operculum is protecting the gills. And they also have an ability to kind of control their buoyancy, or ability to kind of float or stay in a spot in the water without sinking. This is done with the swim bladder. So the swim bladder is basically a sac which kind of fills up with air and allows them to kind of regulate their depth in the water. Now, let's look at some details of the ray-finned fishes, or the actinopterygii. So these are going to be all your familiar types of fishes. So here we can see just a couple examples. We have a yellowfin tuna. Some of you may actually eat that. We have a lionfish, which is really cool looking. The seahorse belongs to this group, and the eel belongs to this group. The fins are supported mainly by long, flexible rays, as that's why they're called the ray fishes. And these are going to be modified in this way for better maneuvering, defense, and other functions in certain different types of species. All right, let's take a look at the lobe fins, or the lobe-finned fishes. These are called the Sarcopterygii, which haven't mentioned, this name hasn't been mentioned before, but this includes a couple different groups. What's interesting about the lobe-finned fish, or the Sarcopterygii, is they have a muscular pelvic and pectoral fins. And they use these to swim, and they kind of walk underwater across the substrate. Because they're muscular, it allows them to kind of perform a walk-like motion. The three surviving lineages of the lobe fins, or the Sarcopterygii, include the coelacanths, or the actinistia, which are there's an example shown below, the lungfishes, which are called the dipnoi, and the tetrapods, as mentioned before. Let's take a look at the lungfish. All right, let's take a look at the lungfish, or the dipnoi. You can see two images above here. These are all found in the southern hemisphere. They have gills as their main source for gas exchange, but they can also go to the surface and take in air into their lungs, and that's why they're called lungfish. The last surviving lineage of the lobe fins are actually the tetrapods, and interestingly, the tetrapods are able to live on land, and they have limbs and lungs. But part of their developmental life cycle includes life in water as well. Okay, so let's talk about the origin of tetrapods. So we've been dealing with most organisms that live in water, and we've ended with fish that actually have lungs. So they live in water, so they have gills, and they can perform gas exchange via gills, but they also have lungs, the lungfish. So they can come to the surface and actually inhale air and obtain their gases and oxygen in that manner. Now, tetrapods are those types of organisms, very similar, so they can live in water, but they can also live in land, and have adapted so that part of their life cycle is going to be on land. So they depend on lungs in order to obtain oxygen once they end up on land. So the evolution of tetrapods is thought to be linked by the discovery of a fossil called Tiktaalik. This is a nickname to fishapod because it actually has characteristics of both fish and tetrapods. Now, the Tiktaalik is basically most likely it's hypothesized to be able to prop itself on its fins, but not actually walk. And we already saw an example of a fish that wasn't one that actually could live on land, but it's one that could kind of walk in water in a way. But it's one that doesn't survive on land. Now, the first tetrapods appeared over 300 million years ago. Pod. So let's look at the different characters regarding fish. So if we look at this, there's evidence in the fossil record that there are scales like fish and fins like fish. And it's assumed that the gills and lungs were present, even though those are soft tissues and those do not fossilize. But the tetrapod characteristics include a neck-like structure, ribs, which are seen in the fossil record, a skeleton of the fin, which is one of the fish characters, but also a tetrapod character because it would be considered a limb. And the skeleton has characteristics of digits, having digits, and the specific bones that are related to those organisms that actually live on land. We have the humerus, the ulna, and part of wrist-type bones, and you can see actual limbs or phalanges here, the radius and the elbow. And also a skull, a flat skull with eyes on the skull. So there's eye sockets. Okay, so these are the characteristics of the fishapod, which kind of suggests that this is leading to the evolution of the tetrapods that are living. So this organism, the tiktaalik, is put right in the middle of a bunch of organisms that are no longer living. So these are all extinct, but you can see the progression. We have the lungfish, right? So this is the lungfish. It actually has a lung, but it doesn't have limbs. But you can see the progressive origin of limb-like structures as we move through and land at the amphibians. And then furthermore, the amniotes. So the amniotes will be the subject of the next segment. But let's talk about the amphibians. So in order to talk about the amphibians, we must talk in terms of the general characteristics of tetrapods. As I already mentioned, that the tetrapods are gnathostomes with limbs. So the fins of some of the lobe-finned fish are hypothesized or have really evolved into limbs and feet, making the group tetrapods. So the tetrapods have some specific adaptations which allow them to live on land. One, they have 4 limbs and feet with digits, which doesn't really allow them to live on land, but allows them to walk a little bit better on land. They don't need to swim. They have a neck, which allows separate movement of the head from the body. Fusion of the pelvic girdle to the backbone. So this provides some strength and some ability to withstand the force of gravity. And the absence of gills, except some aquatic species or some parts of their life cycle, which may possess gills. So they have lungs. And they have ears for detecting sounds that might transport via air. Now let's look at the phylogeny. This is going back to the basic tree that we've seen. So we started long before with the Chondrichthyans and then the Osteichthyans, which include the actinopterygian, the actinista, and the dipnoi, which the actinistia and the dipnoi include the sarcopterygi, which are the lobe fins. So again, it's thought that the lobe finned, some of the species, the lobe fins actually evolved into digits or limbs with digits. And this is bringing us to the amphibia. Now, amphibians include 3 clades. Some of them do not have limbs. So the amphibians include the Urodela, which are the salamanders, the Anura, which include the frogs, and the Apoda, which are those snake-looking like organisms called the Caecilians. Look at the characteristics of each one of these. But in terms of amphibian, it means both ways of life. They usually undergo metamorphosis where there's an aquatic larva and then the adult is terrestrial. So the adult lives on land. And you can see here the tadpole and frogs is aquatic. It's the larvae. And then it starts to grow limbs and eventually develops lungs and is able to move to land. So this is the process of metamorphosis. Tadpoles are generally herbivores. Again, they do not have legs. They do have lungs and like gill-like structures and external eardrums. They are adapted to be carnivorous, but this may arise during metamorphosis. Most of them have moist skin, which helps the lungs with the gas exchange in water. So often frogs in this group of tetrapods will return to water for the mating, where they're going to lay their eggs out to allow the tadpole to develop. Remember, the tadpole is the larvae, and that's going to be aquatic. Fertilization is external in most species, so the eggs and sperm are going to be released into the water, right? And then they're going to fuse in the water. Most eggs, of course, are going to require a moist environment, such as some aquatic environment. In some species, the males or females will care for their eggs on their back, in their mouth, or in their stomach. This could be called a mobile nursery. So this shows a frog right here with the eggs or the developing eggs on their back. All right, so let's look at the frogs. You're pretty familiar with this group. There's a very colorful one down there. Often the bright colors might mean danger. So frogs belong to the formal group called Anura. And what this means is they lack tails. So these are a group of amphibians that lack tails. However, they do have powerful hind legs, which allow them to move very fast or even jump on land. Frogs that have a leathery skin, some of them are very soft and smooth and kind of slick-like, but some of them have a leathery skin. These are called toads. Now let's look at the caecilians. The caecilians look like worms, however, they are amphibians. These belong to the formal group called Apoda, and Apoda means that they have no legs. They are nearly blind, so they really can't see anything, and they resemble earthworms. So going back to the tree, and to recap from previous segments, so if you remember from chapter 33 covered some deuterostomes, which are also invertebrates, which are the echinodermata. Then we move into chapter 34, and chapter 34 started out with the chordates that are not vertebrates. So the chordates have a notochord along with 3 other key characteristics. These include the cephalochordata, or the lanceolate, and the urochordata, the tunicates. And then we moved into the vertebrates, which include the Myxinae, the Petromyzodonta, the Chondrichthyans, which included the Osteichthyans, the Echinacea, and basically the lobe-finned fish and the Sarcopterygii, which include the Dipnoi. And then we moved into the Amphibia. So now we're moving into the more derived group of deuterostomes. We've passed, and basically all the rest now include vertebrate. They include jaws. They have lungs or some derivative of lungs. We're starting to move into organisms that move on land now, so they don't have the fins. Now we have organisms that have limbs with digits, and now we're going to move into the amniotes, which also have an amniotic